Have you ever wondered how to master the exposure in photography? Well, exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor, and it's fundamental to creating stunning images. Too little light, your photo is underexposed, too dark to see details. Too much light, your photo is overexposed, washed out. Striking the right balance is key, and that's where the exposure triangle comes into play. This triangle comprises three elements that work together to influence exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Aperture controls the amount of light entering your lens, shutter speed regulates the duration of light hitting the sensor, and ISO determines your camera's sensitivity to light. In this video, we'll dive deep into each of these elements, exploring how they interact to create the perfect exposure. By understanding these components, you can take your photography skills to the next level. So, what exactly is aperture? Well, imagine aperture as the eye of your camera. It's a hole within the lens that lets light into the camera body. It's one of the three critical elements of the exposure triangle, alongside shutter speed and ISO, that work together to create the perfect exposure for your photos. Now, let's dive into how aperture works. The size of the aperture can be adjusted, similar to how the iris in your eye expands and contracts to control the amount of light that reaches your retina. In photography, this size is measured in f-stops like f2, 8, f5, 6, or f16. A lower f-stop number means a larger aperture, while a higher f-stop number indicates a smaller aperture. Sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But once you get the hang of it, it'll become second nature. So, why is controlling the aperture so important? Well, it directly affects two things: the exposure and the depth of field of your images. A larger aperture, remember that's a lower f-stop number, allows more light to reach the image sensor, making your image brighter. This is great for low-light situations. On the flip side, a smaller aperture, a higher f-stop number, lets in less light, hence darkening your image. This is useful in overly bright conditions. Now let's talk about depth of field. It refers to how much of your image is in sharp focus. A larger aperture creates a shallow depth of field, meaning only a small part of your image will be in focus, while the rest will be blurred. This effect is often used for portrait photography to make the subject stand out. A smaller aperture, on the other hand, results in a larger depth of field, keeping more of your scene in focus. This is typically used in landscape photography. In essence, mastering aperture is all about striking the right balance between light and focus. Remember, a wider aperture allows more light while a narrower aperture allows less. And with that, you're one step closer to mastering the art of exposure in photography. Next up in the exposure triangle is shutter speed. This is the heartbeat of your camera, the rhythmic click that lets light into your camera sensor. It's a measure of how long your camera's sensor is exposed to light, and it's crucial in determining the overall brightness of your photos. Imagine your camera as an eye. The shutter is like the eyelid, and the shutter speed is how long that eye remains open. The longer it's open, the more light it lets in, thus making your photo brighter. Conversely, a faster shutter speed means the eye is open for a shorter period, letting in less light and producing a darker image. But shutter speed does more than just adjust brightness. It also plays a pivotal role in capturing or blurring motion. If you've ever seen a photo of a hummingbird frozen in mid-flight or a waterfall transformed into a silky flowing curtain, that's shutter speed at work. Let's delve into that a bit more. A fast shutter speed, say 1/2000th of a second, is like a blink of an eye. It freezes motion, capturing a split second in time. This is perfect for high-speed action shots, like sports photography or wildlife in motion. On the flip side, a slow shutter speed, like half a second or longer, allows for the depiction of motion. It's like taking a long, leisurely gaze. Anything that moves during that time will appear blurred. This technique is often used in landscape photography to create that dreamy effect of flowing water or streaking clouds. So to recap, shutter speed affects the brightness of your photos and how motion is portrayed. A fast shutter speed freezes motion and gives a darker image, while a slow shutter speed captures the blur of motion and produces a brighter image. As you experiment with different shutter speeds, you'll start to see how this element of the exposure triangle can drastically affect your image outcome. Higher shutter speeds freeze action, while slower shutter speeds create a sense of motion. You're one step closer to mastering the exposure triangle and creating the perfect shot. Scene script. Last but not least, in the exposure triangle, we have ISO. ISO in photography stands for International Standards Organization. This refers to the industry norm that sets the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor. It's a crucial part of the puzzle that shapes the exposure of your photos. Now you might be wondering, how does ISO affect my shots? Well, adjusting ISO changes the brightness of your photos. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive your camera is to light, and the darker your image. On the flip side, a higher ISO makes your camera more light sensitive, resulting in a brighter picture. It's like turning the dial on a dimmer switch. But remember, ISO isn't just about brightness. It also impacts the overall quality of your image. Here's where we introduce the concept of noise. Noise refers to the grainy or speckled appearance that can pop up in your photos, which can be a byproduct of higher ISO settings. You can think of it as static on an old television set. It's not always something you want, and it can sometimes obscure the finer details in your shots. Now let's dive into some examples. If you're shooting in a well-lit environment, like outdoors on a sunny day, you can afford to keep your ISO low, maybe around 100. This will give you crisp, clear shots with minimal noise. But what if you're trying to capture a magic moment in a dimly lit room, or maybe the twinkle of the stars on a clear night? In these situations, you might need to crank up the ISO to let more light into your camera. But remember, the higher you go, the more noise you introduce. So, finding the right balance is key. It's a dance between capturing enough light and preserving the quality of your image. To sum it up, ISO is the final piece of our exposure triangle. It controls the brightness of your photos and affects the level of noise. Higher ISO values increase brightness, but also increase noise, so use it wisely. Now that we've covered the three elements, let's talk about how they work together. Picture the exposure triangle as a three-legged stool. Each leg represents an element of exposure: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If one leg is shorter or longer, you have to adjust the others to keep the stool balanced. That's the essence of managing exposure in photography. The aperture controls the depth of field. A wide aperture lets in more light and creates a shallow depth of field, ideal for portraits. A small aperture lets in less light, but provides a greater depth of field, perfect for landscapes. The shutter speed determines how long the sensor is exposed to light. Slow shutter speeds allow more light in, capturing motion blur, which can be great for showing movement. Fast shutter speeds let in less light and freeze the action, making them ideal for sports or wildlife photography. The ISO adjusts the sensor's sensitivity to light. A low ISO number means less sensitivity and less noise, great for well-lit situations. A higher ISO increases sensitivity and can help in low-light situations, but at the cost of more noise. So, how do you balance these elements? It depends on your creative vision and the lighting conditions. If you're shooting a landscape on a sunny day, you might choose a small aperture for a wide depth of field, a fast shutter speed to freeze the action, and a low ISO to minimize noise. On the other hand, if you're shooting a portrait in low light, you might opt for a wide aperture to blur the background, a slower shutter speed to let in more light, and a higher ISO to increase sensitivity. Remember, each adjustment will impact the others, so it's a constant game of give and take. Play around with these settings, experiment, and see what works best for your style and the situation. There's no right or wrong here, only what helps you capture your vision. Mastering exposure is all about balancing aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to achieve your creative vision. So, are you ready to master exposure in photography? We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We started with the exposure triangle, a key concept that binds together aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Each element of this triangle plays a vital role in determining the exposure of your photos. The aperture controls the amount of light entering the lens. The shutter speed dictates how long your camera's sensor is exposed to light, and the ISO determines the sensor's sensitivity to light. Together, they create a harmonious balance that can make or break your photos. But don't forget about white balance and color temperature. They're just as crucial in influencing the mood and feel of your photos. Adjusting white balance allows you to manage how colors are rendered in different lighting situations. So don't be afraid to experiment with these settings. Play around, make mistakes, learn from them. That's how you grow as a photographer. Remember, mastering exposure is a journey, so keep practicing and exploring, and you'll see your photography skills soar.